On the 22nd of April 1956, a Soviet signals maintenance crew working in the eastern sector of Berlin struck something unexpected. Digging down to trace a fault in their underground telephone cables, they broke through into a chamber that should not have existed. What they found was unlike anything they had encountered before: a tunnel 6 feet in diameter, stretching more than 1,500 feet from the American sector deep beneath the Soviet zone. It was fully lit, air-conditioned, and lined with sandbags. Steel racks held rows of amplifiers and recording equipment, all of it connected by a sophisticated tap into 3 major Soviet military communication cables. The tunnel was, in every respect, a marvel of engineering and espionage. Within hours, Soviet and East German officials descended on the site. They brought journalists with them. Photographers were led underground to capture the scene, and the images were broadcast around the world. Here was proof, the Soviets declared, of Western aggression and dirty tricks played out beneath the streets of a divided city. At a hastily arranged press conference, Soviet officers displayed the American-made equipment and condemned the operation as a flagrant violation of international norms. East German newspapers ran front-page stories for days. The propaganda value was considerable, and Moscow intended to extract every ounce of it. For the CIA, the exposure was a painful blow. The tunnel, built in secret over the course of several months in 1954 and 1955, had been one of the most ambitious intelligence operations of the Cold War. At its peak, teams of translators and analysts in Washington and London processed hundreds of thousands of intercepted communications from Soviet military commanders, diplomats, and intelligence officers stationed in East Germany. The material was considered so valuable that it reshaped Western understanding of Soviet force deployments, logistics, and command structures across Eastern Europe. Senior officials in both the CIA and the British Secret Intelligence Service regarded the tunnel as a triumph, a window into the enemy's inner workings, at a time when reliable intelligence from behind the Iron Curtain was desperately scarce. But the real story of the Berlin Tunnel was far stranger than either side admitted in 1956. The Soviets had known about the tunnel before a single shovel broke ground. A British intelligence officer named George Blake, recruited by the KGB years earlier, had been present at the original planning meetings in London. Blake passed the details to his Soviet handlers, who faced an agonizing choice. They could shut the operation down before it started, or they could let it proceed and protect their spy. Moscow chose to protect Blake. For 11 months, the tap ran, and Western intelligence gathered a flood of intercepted traffic, all while the KGB quietly ensured that nothing passing through those cables would compromise their most sensitive operations. The Soviets sacrificed real military communications to keep one man hidden. The discovery of the tunnel in April 1956 looked like a Soviet intelligence victory. In truth, it was a carefully managed exposure, timed and executed to conceal the deeper secret. The full story would remain buried for another decade, until Blake's arrest in 1961 began to unravel the layers of deception on both sides. This is the story of Operation Gold, the spy who betrayed it, and the shadow war fought 6 feet beneath the streets of Berlin. Part 1. Cold War Berlin and the Intelligence Gap. In the spring of 1945, Berlin lay in ruins. Allied bombers and Soviet artillery had reduced the capital of the Third Reich to a landscape of shattered facades and cratered streets. More than a third of the city's buildings were destroyed or severely damaged. Refugees, displaced persons, and stunned survivors picked through rubble in search of food, shelter, and some way to begin again. Into this devastation came the armies of 4 nations, each claiming a piece of the city that Adolf Hitler had once promised would stand for 1,000 years. The arrangement had been agreed upon before the war even ended. At conferences in Yalta and Potsdam, the Allied leaders carved Germany into 4 occupation zones. The Americans held the southwest, the British the northwest, the French a smaller western zone, and the Soviets, the vast eastern portion stretching from the Elbe to the Oder. Berlin itself, sitting deep inside the Soviet zone, received the same treatment in miniature. The city was divided into 4 sectors, each administered by one of the occupying powers. It was an arrangement born of wartime necessity and mutual suspicion, and from the very beginning it carried the seeds of confrontation. For the first few years, the four powers maintained an uneasy coexistence. Joint patrols moved through the city. Officials from all four nations sat together on the Allied Control Council, but the cooperation was shallow and fraying. The Soviets stripped their zone of industrial equipment, shipping entire factories eastward as war reparations. They installed German communists in positions of authority and began reshaping their sector in the Soviet image. The Western powers, alarmed by Soviet ambitions, moved toward merging their zones into a single economic unit and introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, in June of 1948. The Soviets saw this as a provocation, and their response was swift and dramatic. On the 24th of June, 1948, Soviet forces cut all road, rail, and canal links between West Berlin and the western zones of Germany. The blockade was total. 2.5 million people in the western sectors of the city were suddenly isolated, cut off from food, fuel, and essential supplies. The Soviet calculation was straightforward: starve the western sectors into submission, force the Americans, British, and French to abandon their footholds in the city, absorb all of Berlin into the Soviet sphere. The Western response defied every expectation. Rather than retreat or provoke a ground confrontation, the Americans and British launched an airlift on a scale that astonished the world. Day and night, transport planes flew into Tempelhof and Gatow airfields, carrying coal, flour, powdered milk, and machinery. At the peak of the operation, a plane landed in West Berlin every 60 seconds. Over the course of nearly 11 months, Allied aircraft delivered more than 2 million tons of supplies. The blockade broke the last illusions of cooperation between East and West. In May of 1949, the Soviets quietly lifted it, having failed to dislodge the Western presence. But the damage to any pretense of partnership was permanent. Within months, two new German states emerged: the Federal Republic of Germany in the west and the German Democratic Republic in the east. Berlin remained divided, a western island surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory. The city became the single most dangerous flashpoint of the Cold War, the place where the two great power blocks stood face to face with nothing but a line on a map between them. And it was here, in this divided city, that intelligence became a matter of survival. By the early 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency and the British Secret Intelligence Service faced a problem that grew more urgent with each passing year. The Soviet Union had stationed an estimated 250,000 troops in East Germany. This was the largest concentration of Soviet military power outside the borders of the USSR itself. Tanks, artillery, mechanized infantry, and tactical air units were deployed across the German Democratic Republic in positions that could, in theory, launch an assault on Western Europe with little warning. NATO planners needed to know the strength, disposition, and intentions of these forces, and they had almost nothing reliable to go on. The problem was partly structural. The Soviet military operated behind a curtain of secrecy that made Western intelligence collection painfully difficult. Human agents were scarce and vulnerable. The East German Ministry for State Security, soon to become infamous as the Stasi, worked hand in glove with Soviet counterintelligence to identify and neutralize anyone suspected of passing information to the West. Networks that had been established in the chaotic early post-war years were rolled up one by one. Sources disappeared into prisons or simply stopped communicating. By 1952, the CIA's Berlin operations base had precious few assets capable of reporting on Soviet military activity in any systematic way. The Korean War made the gap feel existential. In June of 1950, North Korean forces, equipped and trained by the Soviet Union, launched a surprise invasion of South Korea. The attack came with almost no warning from Western intelligence services. The parallel to Europe was impossible to ignore. If Soviet-backed forces could strike without notice in Asia, the same could happen in Germany. NATO commanders looked at the map of Central Europe, at the Soviet divisions arrayed across East Germany, and saw a threat they could neither adequately monitor nor confidently predict. Signal intelligence offered a potential lifeline, but it too had its limits. During the Second World War, the interception and decryption of radio communications had given the Allies deep insight into enemy operations. But by the early 1950s, the Soviets had learned from those wartime lessons. Sensitive military communications in East Germany increasingly traveled not by radio, but through underground cables, buried landlines that carried telephone conversations, teletype traffic, and command signals between Soviet military headquarters, airfields, and logistics depots. These cables were physically inaccessible to Western listening stations. You could not intercept a signal that never traveled through the air. This was the intelligence gap that haunted the men responsible for Western security in Berlin. They knew a threat existed. They could see the Soviet garrisons and count the aircraft on runways. But the fine grain of military planning, the orders, the readiness levels, the logistical preparations that would precede any attack, all of it flowed through copper wires buried beneath East German soil. Getting access to those wires became the central obsession of a small group of intelligence officers in London and Washington. The idea of tapping underground cables was not entirely new. During the war, both sides had engaged in various forms of communications, interception, including physical taps on telephone lines. But the notion of digging a tunnel into hostile territory to reach buried military cables was something altogether more ambitious. It required engineering on a significant scale, carried enormous risks of detection, and demanded a level of cooperation between intelligence services that was rare, even among close allies. The breakthrough came from Vienna. In 1949, a British intelligence officer named Peter Lunn arrived in the Austrian capital to take charge of the MI6 station there. Lunn was an unlikely spymaster. The son of Sir Arnold Lunn, a famous mountaineer and skiing pioneer, Peter Lunn had himself competed as a ski racer before the war. He was slight, precise, and quietly determined, a man who brought an engineer's temperament to the craft of espionage. Vienna, like Berlin, was a divided city under four-power occupation, and Lunn quickly identified an opportunity. Soviet military communications in Austria ran through underground cables that passed beneath the British and French sectors. If those cables could be reached, the traffic they carried could be tapped. By 1951, Lunn had organized what became known as Operation Silver. British engineers dug short tunnels from buildings in the British sector to reach Soviet cable junctions running beneath Vienna's streets. The taps were installed successfully, and the intercepted traffic proved highly valuable. Soviet military telephone conversations, command traffic, and logistical communications flowed into British recording equipment. The intelligence product from Operation Silver gave London its first reliable window into Soviet military operations in Austria. It was a proof of concept, and it did not go unnoticed in Washington. Frank Rowlett was among those who paid close attention. A veteran cryptanalyst who had spent decades at the heart of American code-breaking efforts, Rowlett had been instrumental in breaking Japanese diplomatic ciphers before the Second World War. By the early 1950s, he held a senior position at the CIA, working on communications intelligence. Rowlett understood better than most what tapped cable traffic could yield. Raw voice intercepts and teletype streams, even when encrypted, provided patterns, order of battle information, and operational details that no human agent could match in volume or reliability. When he learned of the British success in Vienna, he saw the possibility of something far larger. Lunn, meanwhile, had been transferred from Vienna to Berlin. He arrived at the MI6 station in the divided city and immediately began surveying the landscape for a similar operation. The challenge in Berlin was greater than in Vienna. The Soviet sector was more tightly controlled, the distances were longer, and the stakes were higher. But Lunn identified a target that made the risks worth contemplating. A junction of three major Soviet communications cables ran beneath the Schönefeld Highway in the district of Alt-Glienicke, in the Soviet sector of Berlin. These cables carried a dense concentration of military traffic connecting Soviet headquarters with units stationed across East Germany. Critically, the cable junction lay close to the boundary with the American sector. The distance from American-controlled territory to the cables was significant but not insurmountable, perhaps 300 meters or so. Lunn shared his findings with the Americans. Rowlett and his colleagues at the CIA recognized the potential immediately. If a tunnel could be dug from the American sector to reach those cables, the intelligence harvest could dwarf anything achieved in Vienna. 3 cables meant hundreds of individual circuits carrying voice, teletype, and data traffic. The volume of intercepted communications could transform Western understanding of Soviet military capabilities and intentions in Central Europe. But the undertaking would be unlike anything either service had attempted before. The tunnel would need to be far longer than the short digs beneath Vienna. It would have to pass beneath a major highway in a sector patrolled by Soviet and East German forces. The engineering challenges alone were formidable, involving soil conditions, water tables, ventilation, and the problem of disposing of enormous quantities of excavated earth without attracting attention. Beyond the engineering, there was the question of security. An operation of this scale would require hundreds of people at various stages of planning and construction. Every additional person who knew the secret increased the risk of a leak. In December of 1953, senior officials from the CIA and MI6 met in London to discuss the proposal in detail. The British brought their experience from Vienna. The Americans brought resources and access to the sector boundary near the target cables. The two services agreed to proceed as a joint operation. The CIA would handle construction and provide the cover story. MI6 would contribute technical expertise on cable tapping and signal processing. It was an ambitious partnership between two services that did not always share information willingly, brought together by the scale of the intelligence gap they both faced and the tantalizing prize that lay beneath a highway in the Soviet sector of Berlin. As they laid their plans in that London meeting room, one of the men at the table was already working for the other side. But the tunnel had to be built before it could be betrayed, and the task ahead was straightforward in concept and daunting in execution. They had to dig into enemy territory, tap three of the most sensitive communications cables in Europe, and do it all without the Soviets finding out. Part 2. Digging under the border. The joint operation agreed upon at the London Conference in December 1953 was designated Operation Gold by the CIA and Operation Stopwatch by MI6. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition. They would dig a tunnel from the American sector of Berlin under the border and into the Soviet sector, a distance of roughly 1,500 feet. At the far end, engineers would tap into the three target cables without interrupting service, and the intelligence would flow back through the tunnel to a processing station on the western side. The man chosen to oversee the American end of the operation was William King Harvey, the CIA station chief in Berlin. Harvey was one of the most colorful figures the agency ever produced. Born in Indiana in 1915, he had studied law before joining the FBI during the Second World War. He proved himself an effective counterintelligence officer, but his relationship with J. Edgar Hoover soured, and by 1947 he had moved to the newly formed CIA. It was a better fit for his temperament. Harvey was heavy-set, with bulging eyes and the florid face that gave him a vaguely amphibian appearance. He drank heavily, often starting before lunch, and kept a pistol in his desk drawer at all times. He was known to carry a weapon on his person even at diplomatic functions, tucked into his waistband or strapped to his ankle. His colleagues described him as brilliant, paranoid, and completely fearless. He had already made his name inside the agency by identifying Kim Philby, the senior MI6 officer later exposed as a Soviet mole, as a security risk. Alan Dulles, the director of Central Intelligence, considered Harvey one of the most effective operators in the agency, a man who got results and worried about the paperwork later. Harvey threw himself into the tunnel project with a single-minded intensity that alarmed even his own staff. The first challenge was the cover story. A tunnel of this length required a substantial staging area, and any unusual construction activity near the border would attract Soviet attention. The solution was to build what appeared to be a routine military facility. In the summer of 1954, the U.S. Army began constructing a large warehouse compound in the Rudow district of the American sector, close to the border with Alt-Glienicke. The facility was designated as a radar intercept station, a plausible enough explanation for the antenna arrays mounted on its roof. Local residents and Soviet observers would see army trucks coming and going, communications equipment being installed, and soldiers manning the perimeter. What they would not see was happening underground. Beneath the warehouse, engineers excavated a deep basement that served as the tunnel's starting point. The digging began in earnest, and the scale of the engineering challenge became apparent immediately. The tunnel had to run at a depth sufficient to avoid detection by surface vibrations or accidental discovery during road repairs. It had to be structurally sound enough to support the weight of the ground above it, including the traffic that passed along the streets of Alt-Glienicke. and it had to remain secret for months, possibly years, while hundreds of people worked in and around it. The tunnel itself was lined with steel rings and reinforced with sandbags. It was roughly 6 feet in diameter, large enough for a man to walk through in a crouch, but tight enough to keep the excavation volume manageable. Ventilation posed a particular problem. A tunnel full of equipment and personnel generates heat, and in the Berlin winter, that heat could melt snow on the ground above, leaving a telltale line of bare earth tracing the tunnel's path from one sector to the other. Engineers installed an air conditioning system that regulated the temperature inside the tunnel and prevented any thermal signature from reaching the surface. This was 1954 engineering, and the precision required was remarkable. Then there was the problem of dirt. Roughly 3,000 tons of soil came out of the ground as the tunnel advanced foot by foot beneath the border. Every load had to be disposed of without attracting notice. Trucking the earth away was too risky. A convoy of vehicles leaving a supposed radar station loaded with soil would raise questions immediately. The warehouse compound itself provided the answer. Excavated earth was packed into the building, filling unused sections of the structure behind false walls and stacked to the ceiling in spaces that had no other purpose. From the outside, the compound looked the same as it had the week before. From the inside, it was slowly filling with the evidence of what lay beneath it. The digging took approximately 6 months, from the autumn of 1954 into early 1955. Work crews operated around the clock in shifts, and security was absolute. The number of people who knew the tunnel's true purpose was kept as small as possible. Most of the soldiers assigned to the surface facility believed they were staffing a genuine radar station. Only a tight circle of CIA and MI6 officers, along with the engineering teams, understood what the warehouse actually concealed. By early 1955, the tunnel reached its target beneath the streets of the eastern sector. Now came the most delicate phase of the entire operation. Engineers had to access the Soviet communications cables, physically tap into them, and begin extracting signals, all without causing any interruption in service that might alert Soviet technicians to the intrusion. A vertical shaft was dug upward from the end of the tunnel to reach the cables. The tap chamber, as it was known, was a cramped, steel-lined room at the very end of the tunnel, directly beneath a street in the Soviet sector. British post office engineers, specialists in telecommunications equipment, were brought in to handle the physical tap. They had practiced the procedure on identical cable types in London. Working in near silence, they stripped back the outer sheathing of each cable, identified the individual circuits, and attached induction devices that could pick up the electrical signals without making a direct metallic connection. The process took days rather than hours. Any mistake, a momentary drop in signal quality, an unexplained noise on the line, could bring Soviet repair crews to the site and expose everything. The tap was activated in February of 1955. 3 cables were successfully accessed, carrying a combined total of over 1,200 communication circuits. From that moment, a continuous stream of Soviet and East German military communications began flowing through the tunnel and into the warehouse compound in the American sector. Amplifiers boosted the signals as they traveled back through the tunnel, and recording equipment ran day and night in a purpose-built chamber beneath the warehouse, capturing every conversation that passed along those lines. The equipment filled racks that stretched the length of the room, reel-to-reel tape machines turning in rows, attended by technicians who monitored signal quality and swapped out full reels for blank ones around the clock. The volume of intelligence exceeded all expectations. Over the months that followed, the operation recorded approximately 443,000 telephone conversations. Reels of magnetic tape accumulated at a relentless rate, and a logistics chain was established to ship them to processing centers in Washington and London. There, teams of translators, many of them Russian and German émigrés who had fled to the West, worked through the recordings methodically. The conversations covered a wide range of military and administrative business. Soviet officers discussed troop movements across East Germany and Poland. Logistics personnel detailed equipment shipments, supply allocations, and maintenance schedules. Commanders talked about unit deployments, training exercises, and readiness assessments. For Western intelligence analysts, this was an unprecedented window into the Soviet military order of battle in Central Europe. Before the tunnel, much of what the West knew about Soviet force dispositions came from aerial reconnaissance, defector testimony, and fragmentary signals intelligence. The tunnel provided something far more granular. The daily working conversations of the occupation army itself, unguarded, routine, and rich with operational detail. Analysts could track specific units, identify commanders by name, monitor personnel transfers, and build a picture of Soviet military capability that had previously been impossible to assemble. They learned which divisions were at full strength and which were under-equipped. They followed the movement of armored units and artillery batteries. They picked up conversations about morale, discipline problems, and supply shortages that painted a far more human picture of the Soviet military presence than satellite photographs or signals intercepts ever could. The processing centers operated on an industrial scale. In Washington, a dedicated section at CIA headquarters handled the American share of the take, employing dozens of linguists in a secure facility where the recordings were catalogued, transcribed, and analyzed. In London, MI6 ran a parallel effort from a nondescript office building. Translators worked in shifts, and the backlog of untranscribed recordings grew faster than it could be processed. At its peak, the operation generated more raw intelligence than either agency had the staff to handle. Some of the material was time-sensitive, intelligence about imminent troop movements or changes in alert status, and had to be flagged and translated immediately. Other recordings were filed for long-term analysis, building up a comprehensive archive of Soviet military operations in the heart of Europe. Back in Berlin, Bill Harvey ran the operation with characteristic intensity. He visited the tunnel regularly, checked on the equipment, and maintained the security protocols that kept the project hidden. The compound at Rudau hummed with activity that, to any outside observer, looked like nothing more than the routine business of an American military installation. Guards patrolled the perimeter. Trucks arrived and departed on schedule. Radio antennas turned slowly on the roof. Below ground, the tape machines kept turning. The operation depended entirely on secrecy, and Harvey understood its fragility. If the Soviets discovered the tap, the intelligence would stop immediately and the diplomatic consequences could be severe. Every precaution was taken to minimize the risk of exposure. Personnel who entered the tunnel were vetted repeatedly. Communication about the project was restricted to secure channels. And the cover story at the surface was maintained with meticulous attention to detail. Soldiers stationed at the compound went through the motions of operating a radar facility, filing routine reports, and conducting drills that gave the installation a convincing appearance of mundane military life. Even the compound's garbage was monitored to ensure nothing suspicious left the premises. For 11 months, the system worked. The tunnel remained hidden, the tapes kept recording, and the intelligence kept flowing. Western analysts built an increasingly detailed picture of Soviet military strength in Central Europe, the kind of strategic knowledge that shaped planning at the highest levels of NATO. It was, by any measure, one of the most productive intelligence operations of the Cold War. Harvey understood the value of what the tunnel was producing. He did not understand that Moscow had known about it since the planning meetings in London, and that the man who told them was still sitting inside MI6. Part 3. The Mole at the Table. The man who betrayed the Berlin Tunnel was born George Beher on the 11th of November 1922 in Rotterdam. His father, Albert Beher, was an Egyptian-born Sephardic Jew who held British nationality, a status earned through service in the British Army during the First World War. Albert had served in the Middle East during the war, and he carried a deep loyalty to Britain that shaped the household his son grew up in. He named the boy George after King George V as an expression of that loyalty. His mother, Catherine, was Dutch and Protestant. It was an unusual family for Rotterdam, cosmopolitan and caught between cultures, and the young George grew up speaking Dutch, English, and French with equal ease. Albert Beher died when George was 13. The loss was formative. George had admired his father and absorbed his attachment to Britain, but the death left the family financially strained. His mother struggled to keep the household together. George was sent to live with relatives in Cairo for a time, where an uncle introduced him to a wider world of politics and ideas. He attended a French lycée in Egypt, and the experience deepened his facility with languages and gave him an early exposure to the complexities of colonial life. He returned to the Netherlands as a teenager, just as Europe was sliding toward war. When the Germans occupied the Netherlands in May 1940, George Beher was 17. He was too young for military service and too restless to accept the occupation quietly. Within months, he made contact with the Dutch resistance. A family connection, Henri Curiel, a committed leftist who would later become a prominent activist in his own right, helped connect him to underground networks. George's language skills and his composure under pressure made him useful almost immediately. He worked as a courier, carrying messages, forged identity papers, and underground newspapers between resistance cells across the country. He bicycled through German checkpoints with documents hidden on his person, relying on his youth and his fluent Dutch to avoid suspicion. It was dangerous work. The German security services in the Netherlands, aided by a network of Dutch collaborators and informants, were thorough and ruthless. Couriers who were caught faced interrogation by the German security police and deportation to concentration camps. Several people George worked with were arrested. At least one was executed. He continued, displaying a coolness under threat that would define his character for the rest of his life. For 2 years, George balanced his resistance work with the need to keep his British nationality hidden. But by 1942, the Germans had begun systematically interning British subjects in the occupied territories, and George knew it was only a matter of time before he was picked up. At the age of 19, he made the decision to escape. The route was one used by downed Allied airmen and other fugitives. It ran south, through occupied France, relying on a chain of safe houses operated by resistance networks, then across the Pyrenees into neutral Spain. The mountain crossing alone took several days on foot, through rough terrain and freezing conditions, guided by Basque smugglers who charged steep fees and offered no guarantees. George made it through. From Spain, he was moved to Gibraltar and then to England, arriving as a young man with no money, no established connections beyond his dead father's nationality, and a determination to contribute to the war effort. In England, he joined the Royal Navy and was assigned to naval intelligence work, where his gift for languages drew the attention of recruiters from the Special Operations Executive and later from MI6 itself. Before the war ended, he was brought into the Secret Intelligence Service. He was still in his early 20s, but he already had more experience than most officers twice his age. George Beher, who by now had anglicized his name to George Blake, was calm, articulate, and self-contained. He spoke fluent Dutch, English, French, and German, and he would later add Russian and Korean. He impressed his superiors as capable, discreet, and unusually poised for a young man. Those who worked with him in the early years described a person who was unfailingly polite, never boastful, and difficult to read beneath the surface. After the war, MI6 sent Blake to Hamburg to work on intelligence operations targeting the Soviet zone of occupied Germany. He performed well, and in 1948, at the age of 25, he received a significant posting. He was sent to Seoul, South Korea, under diplomatic cover as vice consul. His real assignment was to build an intelligence network that could operate against the Soviet Union and Communist China from the Korean peninsula. It was a prestige posting for a young officer, and Blake threw himself into the work. Then, on the 25th of June 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and the Korean War began. Seoul fell within days. Blake, along with other Western diplomats and civilians, was captured by the advancing North Korean army. He would spend the next 3 years as a prisoner of war. The conditions of captivity were harsh from the start and grew worse as the war intensified. Blake and his fellow prisoners, a group that included the British Minister to Seoul, Captain Vivian Holt, and a number of other diplomatic staff, were marched north in forced marches as the front lines shifted. The prisoners walked for miles each day, often at night, to avoid detection by United Nations aircraft. They slept in abandoned buildings and open fields. Food consisted of whatever their guards could scrounge, usually rice and millet, sometimes nothing at all. Medical care was non-existent. During the first winter, temperatures dropped well below freezing, and several prisoners died from dysentery, pneumonia, and sheer exhaustion. Blake, who had already endured deprivation during the occupation of the Netherlands, drew on that earlier resilience. He survived, but the captivity changed him in ways that went far beyond physical endurance. The prisoners were held in a series of camps in the North Korean countryside, moved periodically as military conditions demanded. Blake spent long stretches in close quarters with his fellow captives, and he later described the experience as one of intense psychological pressure and unexpected intellectual awakening. His captors provided Marxist texts, works by Lenin and Marx and Mao, and encouraged discussion. Blake read voraciously. He was an intelligent and reflective man, curious by temperament, and he engaged with the material seriously rather than dismissing it as propaganda. Some of his fellow prisoners recalled him as reserved and thoughtful, a man who kept his own counsel and rarely revealed the direction of his thinking. But it was something beyond the books that tipped him from intellectual engagement into genuine conviction. The United States Air Force carried out a sustained bombing campaign against North Korea throughout the war, one of the most concentrated aerial bombardments in history up to that point. Entire cities were flattened. Blake, from his position in the camps, witnessed columns of refugees fleeing the destruction and saw Korean villages reduced to ash and rubble. He saw the civilian toll at close range, women and children and old men caught in a war they had no part in choosing. The scale of the destruction affected him profoundly. In later accounts, Blake described this as the turning point, the experience that made him feel the West had forfeited its claim to moral authority. He began to see the Cold War through different eyes, and the framework of loyalty that had carried him from Rotterdam to London to Seoul started to fracture. By the time Blake made contact with Soviet intelligence during his captivity, the decision had already crystallized. He offered his services to the KGB voluntarily. There was no blackmail, no coercion. He approached them. The Soviets, hardly believing their luck, assigned him the codename Diamid and began the process of establishing secure communication protocols for when he returned to the West. Blake was not merely agreeing to pass the occasional piece of information. He was committing to a second life as a fully recruited agent operating inside one of the Western world's most secretive intelligence agencies. In April 1953, the Korean War armistice negotiations were nearing completion, and Blake was released along with other British prisoners. He returned to England and was welcomed as something of a hero, a young officer who had endured 3 years of captivity with fortitude and loyalty. MI6 debriefed him, found nothing alarming, and returned him to active duty. He was assigned to Y section, the part of MI6 responsible for technical intelligence operations, including wiretapping, signal interception, and the exploitation of communications infrastructure. It was exactly the kind of assignment that would give a Soviet agent access to the most sensitive technical secrets in the British intelligence establishment. Blake settled back into life in London with the quiet discipline that characterized everything he did. Colleagues found him pleasant, capable, and unassuming. He socialized normally, attended office functions, and gave every outward appearance of a dedicated MI6 officer rebuilding his career after a traumatic posting. Behind that composure, he was already passing material to his KGB handler. The moment that sealed the fate of the Berlin Tunnel came in December 1953. MI6 and the CIA convened a joint planning conference in London to discuss the proposed operation against Soviet communications in Berlin. The conference brought together senior technical officers from both agencies to work out the engineering, logistics, and intelligence requirements. George Blake, as a member of Y section, was among those invited to attend. Blake sat in the meeting, listened to the presentations, took notes, and absorbed the details of what was being proposed. The target cables, the entry point, the rough dimensions, the partnership between the two agencies. Before the first day of the conference had ended, he had passed a full account of the plan to his KGB handler, Sergei Kondrashev. The Soviets knew about Operation Gold before the tunnel existed even as a blueprint. What followed was one of the most delicate intelligence decisions of the Cold War. The KGB now possessed advanced knowledge of a major Western intelligence operation, and the obvious response was to shut it down, either by rerouting the cables, hardening their communications security, or simply confronting the Americans and British with what they knew. But every one of those options carried the same unacceptable risk. If the tunnel operation was disrupted before it began, or if the Soviets changed their behavior in ways that only foreknowledge could explain, suspicion would fall on the small circle of people who'd attended the London Planning Conference. The investigation would eventually reach George Blake, and Moscow's most valuable penetration agent inside MI6 would be exposed. The KGB chose to protect Blake. The tunnel would be allowed to proceed. Soviet signals personnel would continue using the targeted cables as though nothing had changed, and the CIA and MI6 would be permitted to dig their tunnel, install their taps, and begin intercepting traffic. It was a calculated sacrifice, and the KGB set about managing it with care. They began by quietly rerouting their most sensitive communications away from the cables the tunnel would tap. Intelligence traffic involving the highest priority Soviet operations in Europe was shifted to other channels, ones that ran nowhere near the targeted infrastructure. But the KGB could only do so much without raising suspicion on their own side. A sudden, unexplained change in communications routing would trigger questions from Soviet military signals officers, and it risked drawing the attention of the GRU, Soviet military intelligence. This introduced a further complication. The KGB made the deliberate decision to keep the GRU entirely in the dark. The two Soviet intelligence agencies were rivals, and the KGB had no intention of sharing the existence of an agent as valuable as Blake with a competing service. The result was that the GRU continued to route genuine military intelligence traffic through the very cables the tunnel was about to tap. Soviet military commanders in East Germany carried on with their communications, unaware that every word was about to be recorded by Western intelligence. The consequence was a strange and layered situation. When the tunnel became operational in early 1955, the CIA and MI6 began intercepting a flood of communications. Some of that traffic was genuine, particularly the GRU military channels that the KGB had left untouched. Analysts in Washington and London processed real Soviet military orders, logistics reports, and command communications that provided valuable insight into force structures and deployments across Eastern Europe. Other channels, those the KGB had managed to sanitize, carried traffic that was either routine or deliberately innocuous. The Western intelligence agencies received a mixture of authentic secrets and managed information, and they had no way to distinguish between the two. For 11 months, this arrangement held. Blake continued his work at MI6, passing information to Kondrashev at regular intervals. The tunnel produced material that CIA and MI6 analysts regarded as a major intelligence windfall, and the KGB watched from a distance, confident that their agent remained protected and that the most damaging Soviet secrets stayed out of Western hands. It was an espionage arrangement built on layered deception, and every party involved believed they were winning. Part 4. Discovery, Exposure, and Escape. By the spring of 1956, the Berlin Tunnel had been in operation for close to a year. Hundreds of thousands of conversations had been recorded. Analysts in Washington and London were still processing material that would take years to fully exploit. But in Moscow, the KGB had decided the time had come to shut it down. The challenge for Soviet intelligence was delicate. They knew about the tunnel because George Blake had told them about it before construction even began. But they could not simply announce that fact. Doing so would expose Blake, their most valuable asset inside British intelligence. So the KGB needed a cover story, a plausible way to stumble upon the tunnel that had nothing to do with espionage. They found their opportunity on the 22nd of April, 1956. A team of Soviet and East German Signal Corps engineers began what appeared to be routine maintenance on underground telephone cables in the Altklinike district. Digging along the cable route, they broke through into the tunnel itself. The discovery looked entirely accidental. In reality, every detail had been choreographed. The Soviets moved quickly to exploit the moment for maximum propaganda value. Within hours, Soviet and East German military officials were on the scene. Journalists were invited to tour the tunnel. Photographers captured images of the sophisticated equipment inside, the amplifiers and recorders and miles of cable, all bearing American markings. East German newspapers ran the photographs on their front pages. The story was framed as proof of Western aggression, an outrageous violation of East German sovereignty carried out from a warehouse that the Americans had built on a flimsy pretext. The American and British governments said almost nothing publicly. There were no official admissions, no denials of substance, just silence. Behind closed doors, however, the mood was surprisingly upbeat. CIA officers who had run the operation regarded it as a remarkable success. The volume of intelligence gathered had been substantial, and much of it was clearly genuine. Troop movements, order of battle information, logistics details, communications between Soviet military commanders in East Germany and Moscow. The tunnel had delivered a window into Soviet operations that signals intelligence alone could never have provided. The warehouse in Rudau was quietly dismantled. The tunnel entrance was sealed. Operation Gold was over. What the Americans and the British did not yet know was that the KGB had been watching from the very beginning, and the man who had made that possible was still at work. After the tunnel's exposure, George Blake continued his career in British intelligence as though nothing had changed. He remained in Berlin for a time, then took up a posting in Lebanon, where MI6 maintained a significant presence. Throughout these years, he kept passing information to his Soviet handlers. Agent names, operational details, the identities of people working for the West behind the Iron Curtain. By his own later admission, he compromised approximately 400 British agents during his years as a double agent. Many of those individuals were arrested. Some were executed. The full toll of Blake's betrayal remains difficult to calculate with precision, but it ranks among the most damaging in the history of Western intelligence. Blake might have continued indefinitely had it not been for a Polish intelligence officer named Michael Goleniewski. In the late 1950s, Goleniewski began secretly passing information to the CIA while still working for Polish military intelligence. His material was extraordinarily valuable. Among the leads he provided were references to a mole inside MI6, someone with access to high-level operational planning who had been feeding information to the Soviets for years. The details pointed toward a relatively small circle of officers. In 1961, Goleniewski defected fully to the West, arriving in the United States with a trove of documents and detailed knowledge of Soviet intelligence operations across Europe. The CIA shared his information with their British counterparts, and MI6 began the painful process of narrowing the list of suspects. The evidence pointed increasingly toward Blake. Blake was recalled to London under a routine pretext. On April 4, 1961, he sat down in a room at MI6 headquarters with Harold Shergold, the head of security, and another senior officer. The interrogation began carefully, almost conversationally. Blake denied everything at first. He expressed shock at the suggestion. But as the questioning continued and the evidence was laid out, his composure began to crack. Over 3 days, Blake moved from denial to partial admission to full confession. He acknowledged that he had been working for the KGB since his captivity in Korea. He described the scope of what he had passed. The confession was damning in its breadth. Blake was charged under the Official Secrets Act and tried in camera at the Old Bailey in May of 1961. The proceedings were closed to the public and the press. Almost no details were released at the time. The trial lasted just 1 day. The Lord Chief Justice, Lord Parker of Waddington, handed down a sentence of 42 years in prison, the longest sentence ever imposed by a British court up to that point. It was widely reported that the judge had arrived at the figure by assigning 14 years for each of the 3 main charges and ordering them to run consecutively. The severity of the sentence reflected the scale of the damage. Blake had betrayed an entire generation of intelligence operations. He was sent to Wormwood Scrubs, a Victorian-era prison in West London, originally built by convict labour in the 1870s. It was not a high-security facility in the modern sense. Wormwood Scrubs held a mixed population of inmates, from petty criminals to long-term offenders, and its physical security relied more on routine and walls than on electronic surveillance or modern barriers. Blake settled into prison life with a calm that unsettled some of those around him. He studied, read widely, and made friends among the other inmates. He appeared to accept his sentence, but he had no intention of serving it. Among the prisoners Blake befriended was an Irishman named Sean Bourke. Bourke was a complicated figure, a petty criminal from Limerick with a flair for drama and a deep antipathy toward authority. He had been convicted of sending a homemade bomb through the post to a police officer who had, in Bourke's view, wronged him. He was intelligent, resourceful, and drawn to Blake's quiet charisma and remarkable story. The 2 men formed an unlikely bond. Bourke was released from Wormwood Scrubs before Blake, and once on the outside, he began working on a plan to break Blake out. Bourke did not work alone. He made contact with 2 men whose backgrounds could hardly have been more different from his own. Pat Pottle and Michael Randall were peace activists, members of the Committee of 100, the anti-nuclear direct action group that had organized sit-down protests at military bases across Britain. Both men had served time in Wormwood Scrubs themselves for their activism, and both had met Blake during their sentences. They were motivated less by any sympathy for Soviet communism than by a belief that Blake's 42-year sentence was unjust, grotesquely disproportionate to what other convicted spies had received. Pottle later said that the sentence itself was what convinced him to help. The escape plan they devised was remarkably simple. Bourke had studied the prison's routines and layout during his own time inside. He knew that on Saturday evenings, security at Wormwood Scrubs was lighter than usual. Fewer wardens patrolled the grounds. Blake had a cell on D Hall, and the building had a window that could be reached from outside, along a narrow passage between the hall and the perimeter wall. The wall itself was about 20 feet high, topped with broken glass, but lacking barbed wire or any electronic alarm system. The plan called for Bourke to throw a rope ladder over the wall at a prearranged time. Blake would break a window bar that he had been loosening over a period of weeks, climb out, cross the short distance to the wall, scale it using the ladder, and drop down to the other side where a getaway car would be waiting. On the evening of October 22, 1966, the plan went into action. Blake broke the weakened iron bar from his window, squeezed through the gap, and dropped to the ground below. He moved along the darkened passageway toward the perimeter wall. On the other side, Bourke waited in a side street with a two-way radio and a homemade rope ladder fashioned from knitting needles threaded through rope to form rigid rungs. At the signal, Bourke hurled the ladder over the wall. Blake caught it and began to climb. At the top, he swung his legs over and dropped. The fall was harder than expected. He landed awkwardly and broke his wrist. But he was outside the prison. Bourke helped him into a waiting car and drove him away through the streets of West London. The entire escape, from the broken window to the car pulling away, had taken only minutes. Blake was driven to a series of safe houses in London. For several weeks, he remained hidden in the city while police mounted one of the largest manhunts in British history. Ports and airports were watched. His photograph appeared in every newspaper. The assumption among investigators was that the KGB had organized the escape and that Blake would be smuggled out through some sophisticated intelligence channel. In fact, the KGB had played no role whatsoever. The escape had been organized entirely by Bourke, Pottle, and Randall, three men with no intelligence training and no resources beyond their own ingenuity. The most dangerous phase of the escape came weeks later. Michael Randall and his wife owned a camper van, a modest vehicle with a small living compartment in the back. They built a hidden space beneath one of the compartment's benches, just large enough for a man to lie flat. In December of 1966, Randall drove the camper van to the safe house where Blake was hiding. Blake climbed into the concealed space. Randall, accompanied by his wife and their two young children, drove to Dover, crossed the English Channel by ferry, and continued through Belgium, West Germany, and finally to the border crossing into East Germany. The journey took several days. At each border checkpoint, the family presented their passports and smiled at the guards while Blake lay motionless in the hidden compartment beneath them. The children, too young to understand what was happening, provided the perfect cover. A family on holiday attracted no suspicion. At the East German border, the guards waved them through. Once safely across, Blake emerged from hiding and was handed over to East German intelligence officers who delivered him to the Soviets. Blake surfaced in Moscow in the early months of 1967. The Soviet government confirmed his presence and granted him asylum. He was given a comfortable apartment, a KGB pension, and eventually the Order of Lenin, one of the highest Soviet decorations. He took a Russian name, adopted Russian customs, and married a Russian woman named Ida, with whom he had a son. For the next 5 decades, Blake lived quietly in Moscow. He became something of an elder statesman in the small community of Western defectors and double agents who had found refuge in the Soviet Union. Unlike some of the others, notably Kim Philby, who struggled with alcoholism and depression in exile, Blake appeared genuinely content with his choice. He gave occasional interviews to Western journalists and filmmakers over the years, and his statements were consistent. He expressed no regret for what he had done. He maintained that his time as a prisoner in Korea had opened his eyes to a different way of seeing the world, and that he had acted out of conviction rather than for money. Whether one believes that explanation depends largely on how one views the Cold War itself. Blake outlived the Soviet Union by nearly 3 decades. He watched the Berlin Wall come down in 1989 and saw the country he had served dissolve 2 years later. He remained in Moscow through all of it. Russian President Vladimir Putin, himself a former KGB officer, publicly praised Blake on his 90th birthday. George Blake died in Moscow on December 26, 2020, at the age of 98. As for his rescuers, their story had a remarkable coda. Sean Bourke fled to Ireland shortly after the escape and later went to Moscow himself, though he found life there intolerable and returned to Ireland, where he died in 1982. Pottle and Randall were not charged with any crime for 25 years. It was only in 1991, after they published a book openly describing their role in the escape, that the British government finally prosecuted them. The case went to trial at the Old Bailey, the same courthouse where Blake had been sentenced 3 decades earlier. Pottle and Randall admitted everything. They told the jury exactly what they had done and why. The jury acquitted them both. It was, by any measure, a remarkable verdict, one that suggested the British public had its own complicated feelings about the Blake affair. The Berlin Tunnel itself became a footnote to a larger argument that has never been fully settled. Was Operation Gold a triumph or a failure? The intelligence it produced filled warehouses of tape and occupied analysts for years. Analysts continued to extract useful material from the recordings for years after the tunnel was shut down. Much of what flowed through those tapped cables was genuine and operationally valuable. But the KGB knew about the tunnel from the start, and that knowledge gave them the ability to manage what the Americans and British were hearing. They could allow authentic information to pass while protecting their most sensitive communications. They could feed disinformation when it suited them. The full extent to which they did so remains unknown and probably unknowable. What is clear is that the Berlin Tunnel was an audacious piece of Cold War engineering, a half-year construction project carried out in secret beneath a divided city, producing a river of intelligence that kept analysts busy for years. And it was betrayed before the first shovel broke ground, by a man who sat in the planning meetings, memorized the details, and passed them to the other side. The tunnel and the spy who gave it away remain inseparable, two halves of the same story about the possibilities and the limits of intelligence work in an age of divided loyalties. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.